Welcome back to a solo episode of Recipes for Grief. We might call this Kitchen Table Talk with Andrea. And in this episode, I'll be sharing my recipe for a podcast. This is not a how to start a podcast episode at all, but instead, I would like to share some of my inner life, some of my ancestors, some of the synchronicity and magic that has come forth in the dreaming of and creation and launching of Recipes for Grief. I've wanted to start a podcast for a really, really long time, like 7 or 8 years. I have become someone who has such interesting and rich conversations. This happens with friends and family members I've known my whole life, people I've known for decades. This happens with strangers on the street. It will happen with new friends. You know, there's a magnetism that I experience in life. And so I often find the people who want to have these rich conversations. So it happens frequently. And if you're someone who knows me personally, I have probably said, gosh, I wish we would have recorded this conversation. Knowing that I have such meaningful and poignant connections and conversations with people has not refrained the voices of fear in my mind. When I came up with the concept for this podcast, it was right around December, just before my hysterectomy. I knew that I would be taking the time to further develop the idea for this this podcast, for this dish that I'm serving y'all. And once I started recording, and I think the first recording happened in March, I believe, the fear in my brain started to get loud. It gradually became louder as we inched closer to the launch, April 11th. The night before the podcast was launched. So everything had been done. You know, all the recording had been done, all the editing, there's artwork, there's bios for my guests, there's a website, there's platforms and passwords, and, you know, all of the fine tuning had already happened. Everything was scheduled to be published on Tuesday morning at a very specific time. Perhaps we'll talk about this today or perhaps on a different podcast. Everything has a birthday, and the launch of this podcast was incredibly intentional. We'll bookmark that for later. As I laid in bed, knowing the next morning, the first 5 episodes of this podcast would be in the world. I've shared it with my people on Instagram. I've shared it with my email subscriber list. I've shared it with my besties. I've shared it with strangers. The podcast is going to be out there. My inner critic, my scared, nervous inner child became so loud and so unkind. Throughout the process, I knew I was doing something important because I had so much fear. If I wasn't afraid, and I've done a lot of different things like launching a business, I've moved across the country, I've moved back across the country. I've done a lot of things that maybe could have scared me. And maybe they did at the time. Maybe I had some nerves, but it's been a really long time since I've been so afraid of doing something that I almost didn't do it, or that the fear was so loud that I could have convinced myself not to, if the fear were stronger than my will. But I'm a very willful person. And so, you know, perhaps the first ingredient, if you will, for launching a podcast, while you might need a microphone or a recording device or a subject or a tagline, I think what you really need is a strong will and a belief that what you are doing is so worthwhile. You must do it anyway. And that was the mantra that I kept telling my closest loved ones. I don't know what I'm doing. What am I doing? What have I gotten myself into? I'm so afraid. I can't believe I'm doing this. Someone would inevitably say to me, well, no, this is really important and you should, and da-da-da. And I said, well, yeah, of course, I'm still going to do it. But I am petrified. At what? What are you so afraid of? I'm afraid of being seen. I'm afraid of ruffling feathers. I'm afraid of failing. which I've done spectacularly. But what if it doesn't work out? And what does it mean to work out? And what does it mean to be successful? So all of these things were just swirling in my mind in the time that I was creating the podcast. And so what did I do? Well, I started cooking, of course. So in the early months of 2023, we started making homemade pizzas. We were working with 2 separate doughs that have very different preparation times, preparation ingredients. Both recipes are from America's Test Kitchen. One crust recipe is a same day, 1 to 2 hour dough. The other one is a 3-day ferment, much more delicious dough. But we started making pizzas every Saturday. And in tandem with reading about pizza dough and watching YouTube videos and experimenting week after week, I would also be working on the graphics, listening to music for the intro and the outro, interviewing, editing, you name it, I was doing it alongside eating delicious pizza. This pizza experience does not have the same depth that the rolls do. And if you've listened to the first episode, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And perhaps the pizza does actually. We'll see where this conversation takes me. And actually, perhaps the pizza's meaning in my life is deeper than I'm giving it credit for. Perhaps that'll expose itself as I speak on this. While like most people, I've been eating cheese on bread for, ever. What it was reminding me of during these first few months of 2023 was the 2 years, just a little over 2 years that I lived in New York. I was eating pizza quite a bit during that time. And when I first moved to New York, I moved with the intention to work in publishing. My educational background is in creative writing. And when I was in grad school, I actually started a small press to publish books of poetry, chapbooks, for the incredible writers that I was surrounded by at Cal State Long Beach. Go Beach! Shout out to Long Beach State. So after my mother died, I moved to New York with these grandiose dreams of not quite Sex in the City, but maybe writing in the city. I moved to New York to make it. I ended up working in customer service and marketing for a snack food company. I was selling popcorn. I was in debt. My car that I had left in California to be sold was stolen. And so I was in an incredibly difficult place in my life. I didn't really have anyone I felt comfortable asking for support. I certainly didn't know how to be supported at that time in my life. I was probably 26, 27 years old. I had convinced myself I moved to New York to work in publishing. But really, I moved to New York to grieve the death of my mom, and 2 years prior to her death, the death of my grandmother. Because I had so much debt, even though I had a good enough job, there were times that I would have to steal quarters from my roommates just to get to work. There was a colleague at work who I was cool with, and I would sometimes DM him and ask him for a few extra dollars to take the train back home. And because I was penny pinching so much, often I would eat bread as my meal for the entire day. Over time, it would switch. So maybe I would just eat a few slices of pizza for lunch, and that would cover breakfast and dinner. Other times I'd eat a breakfast sandwich as a late lunch and then pizza for dinner. But it was this staple. It was one of the only things I could afford, just to be frank, was pizza and hot dogs at the at the carts, and I was struggling quite a bit. During my interview for this snack food company, I can remember the marketing manager asking me, "Well, you must have a blog. You love to talk so much. You're so animated. You must have a blog." While I had been very prolific as a creative writing undergrad, and I was involved in the poetry scene as a grad student, getting my master's in English literature. Again, another conversation for a different day. We got a lot to talk about, y'all. I failed my comprehensive exams as I was exiting grad school. That failure, that public embarrassment, everyone knew I failed my test and I would have to stay another semester and take it over. So by the time I had made it to New York, whatever confidence that had been built up over the years, it was wiped out pretty quickly. And the idea of having a public voice was incredibly unappealing to me. I wanted financial stability. I wanted a big life eventually, and I wanted to be fabulous. And none of that happened. When I left New York 2 years and 2 months after I arrived, I had been stripped naked in an emotional sense. Not only did I not make it in New York, quote unquote, make it, but I hit rock bottom. This rock bottom story ends with me in a stairwell with a police officer, their hand on their gun, trying to calm me down because I was hallucinating that it was 9/11 and I thought the building was going to crash upon us. Now, don't ask me how I got into an office building's stairwell at 11 p.m. on a Saturday. I can't answer that because I don't remember. But when I returned home to California, when I returned home to Oakland specifically, when I came back to the Bay a couple months after that experience, I was filled with even more shame than I had when I left college, when I left grad school. Not only do I have nothing to say, but even if I did, who's going to listen to a failure like me? That, my friends, was probably 15 years ago. I'd have to do the math, but it's about 15 years. And for my fellow astrology nerds, about 15 years ago was when I was experiencing my Saturn return, as well as Pluto entering my sun sign and my ascendant sign of Capricorn. Pluto is leaving Capricorn and headed into Aquarius this year. So I've been brought to the underworld and back up again, this Plutonian underworld, basically since I moved back home to the Bay. Now, side note, when I left Oakland at 18 years old, I said I was never coming back. This place has so many ghosts. I didn't know that I could be here in this place. I didn't know if I could incorporate myself into my birth family, into my extended family, with all of my cousins and aunts and uncles. I had been running from grief. I think that's the best way to say it. I had been running from grief, and grief brought me home. And so for the past 15 years, learning how to become comfortable with big emotions, learning how to connect with the other side. I don't want to say that I came to accept the death of my father and my mother and my grandmother and my aunt, but I begin to understand it in a different kind of way. I feel like this conversation can go many different ways, down many different avenues. Because while I was in Long Beach, I can remember the day I stopped believing in God. I remember the moment I stopped believing in God. And then you have, 15 years, give or take, of me returning to the place where I was raised, reincorporating myself into my family of origin, nurturing those relationships, simultaneously defining what spirituality meant for me and coming to a new understanding of what God means in my life. Very different than the punitive God that I was raised with in the Catholic Church. So all of this is a part of my recipe for a podcast. Because if I had not had the losses I've had, if I had not hit rock bottom and had to return home naked and afraid, if I had not had the past 15 years of Pluto shaping me into someone who can be in the dark, who can learn to see in the dark, who can learn to listen to the darkness, I could not be a light. So all of those things, all of those experiences, I know I keep saying we're going to talk about it later because I don't want this to be a 2-hour podcast. All of those experiences have really lent themselves to the person I've become. So creating this podcast was one of the first major creative expressions that I had since leaving college, since leaving Long Beach State. Matter of fact, when I was in New York, I didn't write, not even in my journal. I didn't write a poem, honey. I didn't write a grocery list. I was done. And so little by little, maybe 8 years ago, I took up painting, watercolor, and I would just paint dots actually on paper with watercolor. And then I learned how to make jewelry. And at some point, I started writing in my journal again. I would write a poem every here and there. Some of the things that I used to do when I was a young person, I would write down my favorite words. I would write down quotes that I heard. I would write my feelings. I want to share with you an ancestor who has come to me recently. I talked about him a little bit in episode 4 with Melanie Shekels. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. We're going to take a left turn. Stay with me, y'all. When I was going through the role-making experience, post-fertility experiences, making these roles, having really vivid and incredible dreams throughout that time, I had a dream that I was drawing a peace sign, and there was a gentleman looking over my shoulder, watching me draw a peace sign. I didn't recognize the gentleman, but within a few days, I had shared the dream with one of my best friends, Sim. Shout out to Sim, also creative assistant to the podcast. And he goes, that sounds a lot like my grandfather, Baji. So as we're talking and talking, I'm like, that feels right. That it resonated with me. It was speaking to me. And I started having some experiences with Baji. So for example, within a couple weeks' time, a friend of mine, Karen shares with me a dream she had where we were in a room and there was a lot of noise and upheaval. And Karen said in the dream, I stood up and with a commanding voice, I said, peace. Well, wasn't I just trying to draw a peace sign in my dream? Okay. Where's this coming from? So I would meditate on Baji. I would think about him. I have a picture of him. Sim sent me a photo of Baji, so I have a photo of him on my phone that I look at sometimes. Baji was a linguist, very well respected, very well liked from what I understand. And Baji said to me at one point in meditation, because I said, I have my own grandfathers. Why are you coming to me? This is my brother's grandfather. And Baji says, well, if Sim is your brother, then I am your grandfather. If we are all related, I am everyone's grandfather. What? Okay. There was another time I was walking my dog on our early morning walk, and I found a dollar bill. I sometimes find pennies and dollar bills that I attribute to my father usually, but I found a dollar bill with a purple peace sign stamped onto it. I kid you not. So Baji and I are having these connections. And I'm still asking why? Why me? Why Baji? What's happening? In a different reflection, Baji says to me, I'm here for your creativity. Like if you're working on something creative, call me in. There's a whole council of creatives who want to work with you and other creative people. So I'm like, okay. It's like, well, I've got this podcast. I'm simultaneously choosing colors for the logo and fonts. It actually is a very creative experience, even though I didn't imagine it to be when I first started out on this. And Baji says, leave it to be a creative experience. Because the minute you try to make money from it, now it's a business. And what do you say? The rules of creativity no longer apply and the rules of business take over. Okay. I needed that perspective. So really trying to keep in mind, this podcast is a creative expression for me. I am not a meditation teacher. I'm not a somatic practitioner. I'm not going to teach you in any traditional sense. Do this, do that, do the next thing. That's what this means. That's what that means. Not at all. That is not my place. I am a storyteller. So let me stay in that creative lane of using language to paint a picture and to take people on a journey. So that was incredibly helpful. So another ingredient in the recipe for a podcast is ancestorship, mentors, helping spirits, and making space to listen to what wants to come forth to you to support you. There's this term, pronoia. It's the opposite of paranoia. So in paranoia, we feel like things are conspiring against me. This is out to get me and that's out to get me. And in pronoia, there's this feeling that the universe is conspiring for me. And boy, I felt that creating this podcast, especially with someone like Baji coming forward. Well, Aunt Ophelia also came forward. So let me tell y'all about my Aunt Ophelia. She lived 2 houses down from my grandmother. So I was lucky enough to really grow up with her as a daily presence in my life. My parents and I lived with my grandmother. Before my father died, we all lived together in my grandmother's home. My parents and I had an upstairs apartment. And even though my grandmother was really the one who raised me, if I said who raised me, my grandmother raised me, Ophi was my second mom. It was Ophi who took me to get my first brassiere. I feel like I'm aging myself by calling it a brassiere. Auntie Ophi was the one who caught me making out with a boy, in high school on the couch. In 7th grade, when I got into a fist fight with Ricky, it was Aunt Ophelia who disciplined me. I was living with her at that time. So she has had a huge hand in who I've become. So in my younger years, she lived 2 houses down. And then later I did live with her. And then even after that, when I moved on to a different aunt's house, I was still seeing Aunt Ophelia every weekend. Let me tell y'all, Aunt Ophelia didn't play, period. And I don't just mean she was tough, because Aunt Ophelia didn't play with love either. She loved hard. If she loved you, you knew. And guess what? She loved everyone. Auntie was an usher at our church. Actually, both of my aunts, my Auntie Ophelia and my Auntie Millie. Auntie Millie is still with us. Shout out to Auntie Millie. They would greet every single person who walked into the front doors of our church, St. Patrick's. So, of course, the entire congregation knew her, but also any new person who came through the church doors. It didn't matter who you were. She would welcome you with open arms. She was the kind of person, every time you saw her, she would just greet you with wide, wide open arms and a big smile. After she died 18 years ago, and we're going to talk about her death in just a moment, but after she died, people started coming forward. Oh, Ophelia paid my rent when I was sick. Oh, Ophelia was dropping off cat food when my car broke down. She loved as a verb. And still to this day, I went to church just a couple months ago to my childhood church. And of course, people still talk about her and my grandmother. My Aunt Ophelia created the gospel choir. Even though I grew up in a Catholic church, we actually had a Black gospel choir. And that was started by my Aunt Ophelia in the early 80s. 18 years ago, I did not know that my Aunt Ophelia was going to die, but I think she did. I was living in New York at the time, and she called me, and she was getting all of her affairs in order, and I really didn't think too much of it. That was in summer. Her son died in August. My cousin Gino, he was like a big brother to me, and she died in November. My Aunt Ophelia had been experiencing throat cancer at that time, and she was scheduled to have a surgery. Everyone in the family, her doctors, everyone wanted her to reschedule this surgery, but she wanted to get it over with. So she had surgery within, I don't know, a month or two after her son died. And during the surgery, she had a stroke. Coming out of surgery, post-stroke, she could no longer speak. And let me tell you, she was pissed. My Auntie Ophelia was a truth teller. When I say that she loved as a verb, that was also through hardship. And I know she carried a lot of things on her heart. There were times that she would become incredibly intoxicated, and she would tell me these family secrets that no one else would talk about. I know some things, y'all. So Aunt Ophelia was a truth teller. She was not one to bite her tongue. And so to wake up from this surgery, grieving her son and no longer able to speak, she was mad as hell. Straight up, mad as hell. I remember flying home from New York and visiting her in a convalescent home. It was a very unpleasant visit. She was mad. She couldn't speak. She couldn't write because of the stroke, so she couldn't even write you the instructions she wanted. So for example, she wanted me to wash her hair. Well, it took us a good 20 minutes to figure that out. She was incredibly frustrated. So the end of her life was difficult, at least for us, if not for her. I can't speak about her experiences, but for us who knew her, it was a challenging time. She died a month or so later. And let me backtrack a little bit. Aunt Ophelia's husband, my Uncle Charles, died 5 days after my father in 1987. So to say that my aunt and I were close is an understatement. And there's so much more that could be said about our relationship. I've had a hard time grieving her because she wasn't supposed to die back then, at least not in my opinion, right? I've been very upset and very hurt that she hasn't been here. My mom was sick. My dad was sick. My grandmother, she died at 99. So those were kind of expected deaths for me, at least in retrospect. So 2 days before the launch of this podcast, I'm taking a shower and, I'm thinking about the podcast and I begin to think about Aunt Ophelia. And I'm like, you were supposed to be here for this. I'm very blessed that I have a warm, loving community, a lot of good friends and family and in-laws and people who love and support me. I have no known haters, but it's been challenging to mark important things in my life without my parents. and without my grandmother, and without my Aunt Ophelia. If she were alive today, she'd be 91, which was completely realistic in our family. I have many aunts and uncles who've lived well into their 80s and 90s. My grandmother thought she would at least hit 100, if not live longer than 100. My grandmother had sisters, and I believe even her grandmother lived over 100. So we have longevity on my father's side. And so it's not out of the question that Aunt Ophelia would be 91 here today with me launching this podcast. So I'm in the shower and I'm crying because I just really miss her. And I really wish I could share this life that I've built with her. And then I hear her voice. And she says, "Girl, you better use your voice while you have it." I think you can already understand how poignant that advice is, coming from someone who was a truth teller and whose life came to an end with her losing her ability to communicate. And as a matter of fact, she said to me in the shower, "That's why I chose to leave at that time. I could not live without my voice." So when we fast forward to that night before the launch, and I've got these very unkind voices in my head telling me I'm an idiot and who do I think I am? And I'm so arrogant that I think I deserve a podcast. I can feel Aunt Ophelia's encouragement. Use your voice while you have it. What a blessing that I have a voice. What a blessing that I have opinions. What a blessing that anyone gives a rip about what I need to say, even. And it's also not lost on me. Aunt Ophelia is the one telling this to me, this second mother of mine. But let's review some things. So Aunt Ophelia had lung cancer, just like my dad did. My father died of cancer of the gums, throat, and lungs. My mother had multiple sclerosis, and she lost her ability to speak when I was about 14 or 15 years old. She could no longer control those muscles. Every so often, she'd muster up enough strength and energy to say something. And I hope to share some of those stories with you in future podcasts. But when Auntie said, "Use your voice while you have it," I think she's not just speaking about her own experience. She's touching on the experiences of my father, her brother, as well as my own mother. And even my grandmother, her dedication to Christ was such that it was kind of the only thing she talked about. If you'd say, "Oh, what a beautiful day," she'd say, "Yes, God has graced us with this beautiful day." If you say, "Ooh, I had a nightmare last night," she'd say, "Ooh, well, you better pray to God that you can rest well tonight." And so, my grandmother was very prolific in these adulations to the grace of God. For myself, as someone who was a very curious and questioning child, that seemed like a stifled expression because she wouldn't say other things. I'm not exactly sure how to say it, except that the truth telling that I experienced with my Aunt Ophelia was freeing in a way that my grandmother's glory to God was restrictive to me as a young person. I can remember Auntie would pick me up in her car and we would drive around, not really going anywhere that I can recall, but she would just let me sing. So I'd sit in the front seat. This is the days before you had to be in a booster seat in the back until you were like 12. So, I'm 6, 7 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of her Oldsmobile, singing at the top of my lungs. Whitney Houston, the Our Father, anything I could memorize the words to, I would just sing and sing and sing. And Aunt Ophelia was here for it. Because my mother, a disabled person whose husband is sick with cancer, was not here for it. I love my mother. And she would also tell me to shut up. I was wearing her out, which makes sense, right? She's a disabled person with a full-spirited young child and a sick and dying husband. So I tend not to blame my mother for some of the things that she said to me. I don't know if that's neither here nor there, but I knew that I was getting on my mother's nerves. I knew that the questions I would ask about church and Jesus and the Bible would upset my grandmother. My grandmother would say, don't be a heathen. She would say, ooh, that sounds like the devil's question. When I would push back on some of the catechism that I was being taught. And so again, to be in the shower and to have auntie say, use your voice while you have it. Someone said to me, you better keep her picture on your desk when you record. And so let me tell you, I definitely have her obituary on my desk as I'm recording this right here, right now. I've got to dig up a paper photo, so it's not the obituary, but I'm very grateful for her coming through at such a time when, for the past 18 years, I've been pretty upset at her because she struggled with alcoholism on and off. She and I also had a fraught relationship, and we didn't get to reconcile before she died. We got along fine. We talked, we'd hug, things were gravy. I didn't have the opportunity to release the things that I had been holding on to with her in this realm with me. That's all had to happen post her death, in the therapy room, in meditation, in hypnosis, in dream time, in my heart, really. So thank you, auntie. I miss you so much, girl. So then let me tell y'all, the next day, so now we're one day away from launch, and I was having a dream that I was biting my tongue almost in like a comical way. Like if you've seen a cartoon where like the mouth opens larger than a mouth can open and it chomps down on the tongue, real dramatic like. It was very cartoonish. Child, let me tell you, I bit my tongue so hard, I woke myself up. I kid you not. I bit my tongue in my sleep so hard I woke up. I said, ooh, something is telling me you better bite your tongue. There is this part of me that is so afraid of doing this. I'm telling myself, bite your tongue, shut up, be small, don't ask for attention, go unnoticed, stay safe, okay? And I think a different version of myself might have taken that as a sign that maybe I should shut up. But I knew better by then. By that point, I knew what was happening. I knew that was the part of myself that was afraid to be chastised. That's a part of me that's afraid to be silenced by others. If I silence myself, you can't silence me. If I don't speak in the first place, you can't tell me to shut up. If I don't disrupt things, you can't tell me to be small. So biting my tongue in my dream was actually a sign that I knew I was doing something important for myself. So the podcast launched. An asteroid did not hit the earth. Everything is fine. And then, a couple weeks later, I'm interviewing my brother-in-law, Pedro Navarro, on episode 6. And he's talking about his daughter, Nayeli. And he reminds me of Nayeli and how she used to use her voice. We had actually talked about this before the episode interview, because when Nayeli was sick, she insisted on getting a second dog. So she had convinced the family we should get a dog. They got a small Chihuahua, Chloe, and Nayeli wanted a big dog. And Pedro was telling us how it wasn't like a tantrum, like where she's flailing and being extra. It was like, I want a dog. And she would yell, I want a dog. Like, y'all don't understand. This dog is supposed to be in our family and we're getting a dog. Nayeli, come on, girl. And so here I am listening to Pedro tell these stories about Nayeli. And I'm like, well, damn, here's another ancestor telling me you better use your voice while you got it. Okay. And so on all these different layers, right? Baji and Ofi and Nayeli, but also these ghosts that live inside of me, these experiences I've had of learning, oh, I should be small so I stay safe. I shouldn't take a risk so I don't fail. I shouldn't do this thing I'm really excited about because what if it doesn't work out and I feel embarrassed? All of these things were activated in creating and launching this podcast. It is not easy to follow your heart. I know you know what I'm talking about, right? I'm sure all of us are kind of reflecting, even myself as I'm speaking, I'm kind of like, oh, in what other places in my life am I not following my heart? Let's have some space for self-reflection here. So use your voice while you have it. Make room for creative expression. Don't be afraid to yell. Like Nayeli, right? So the way that I see it, all of these experiences are a part of my recipe. All of these things are nourishing me through this creative experience and through this risk-taking venture. And so I want to share a quote from one of my other ancestors, someone who I'm not related to, but who's become someone whose words, someone whose voice has become so prominent, Octavia Butler. So I am recording this the day after the full moon in Scorpio, lunar eclipse, and I believe conjunct Uranus. The energy of the past few days has been very, very strong. And matter of fact, let me say this, there's other things happening, just small things in my life, in my neighborhood, in my community, of my voice or my expression bristling other people. It's happened actually twice in the past week. So it's very up for me right now. This feeling of, ooh, I said something and now I've upset someone. And can I say it anyway? And be okay with, oh yeah, sometimes I upset people, sometimes other people upset me. Is it okay that we bristle up against each other? Can that be okay? So last night, I saw the Parable of the Sower opera. Parable of the Sower is one of Octavia Butler's books. This opera was written by folk singer Toshi Regan and her mother. And it wasn't until I was sitting in my seat at 8 p.m. on a Friday night, realizing, oh, wow, this book has meant so much to me. And here I am watching its opera on the full moon in Scorpio with the lunar eclipse. Okay, y'all. This energy is potent tonight. If you're familiar with this book, then you will know this quote immediately. You already know it before I even say it. And if you're not familiar with this book, I'm going to recommend it. It's a challenging book to read, especially for people who are sensitive. And I think that, speaking for myself, this book has been a part of my metamorphosis in becoming someone who is preparing for what the future holds. We don't know what that is, but we do know in the past few years, between 45 and MAGA and COVID and the world I knew in 1985, honey child, that world is gone. The future is not what I thought it was going to be. Matter of fact, I had what I call a come to Jesus moment, but for lack of better words. But I had a moment like that in the shower, crying in those early months of the COVID shutdown, where I thought, as someone who has been such a perfectionist and an overachiever, and someone who's really wanted to, quote unquote, succeed in the world, this might be as good as it gets. I have all these plans to recreate a Victorian fireplace in my living room, and I want this type of garden, and I want that type of whatever, fill in the blank. And when COVID hit, I knew in my body, oh, this is why my grandmother prayed all the time. She, in her perspective as a devout Catholic, to her, it was the end times. It was the sign, when bad things would happen in the world, it was like, oh, see, yep, Jesus is coming. But I think underneath that is, how can I have hope in these circumstances? This shit is wild. How am I going to get through this and be a servant to spirit? And I had that feeling that I think I was witnessing in my grandmother as a young person. My grandmother would, stare out the kitchen window. Oh, Lordy. All right. She would, she'd be calling on Jesus. I said, well, shoot, Jesus is coming today. It's Saturday, but today's the day. Yeah, I was ready for him. So I had that experience in the shower, just 3 years ago of, how can I get through this and still be a servant to spirit? How can I move through the world in a way that matters, knowing this wild shit is happening in the world and not being afraid of it, but actually being someone who is secure enough in their own nervous system to not be afraid of the dark. This is the Octavia Butler quote from Parable of the Sower. If you know it, say it with me. Everything you touch changes. Everything you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Okay, y'all. Ultimately, I think that this recipe for a podcast ultimately comes down to the willingness to change. Actually, side note, another excellent book everybody should read, The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. Thank me later. You're welcome. And I love you. I could not keep playing small. I could not continue to be beholden by my fears. I cannot, and I will not silence myself while I have a voice. So I really want to, just extend so much love and gratitude to you, the listener. Thank you for sticking with me. And also to the ancestors, so many who I do not know and cannot name, but those I have named today who have supported me and held me up and encouraged me through this really scary experience of starting a podcast. Baji, Antophilia, Nayeli, Octavia Butler. I feel like there's so much more I could say. So that'll be a conversation for a different day. Thank you for listening to Kitchen Table Talk with Andrea on this here Recipes for Grief episode. More to come, and thank you.